Welcome to Dolby Creator Talks. This is a show about how artists use technology to tell their stories, and I'm your host, Glenn Kaiser. If you love the movies, The Studio on Apple TV Plus is a real treat. It's an absolutely hilarious skewering of the film business with lots of meta commentary and an incredibly funny cast, including legendary directors like Ron Howard and Martin Scorsese guest starring as themselves. One of the really cool things about the show is that almost all the scenes are shot as oneers, that is, long scenes which all play out as single shots. It's truly remarkable at times with cinematography that perfectly frames the comedy. So I'm delighted to welcome cinematographer Adam Newport-Berra, the director of photography of the series, including episode 2, which is appropriately entitled The Oner. It's a show where the entire 25-minute episode is presented as one continuous take. So that's where I wanted to start our conversation about how co-creators and directors Seth Rogen and Evan Goldberg got the crazy idea to shoot the show in this way in the first place, and how they found the perfect cinematographer to pull it off. Here's director of photography, Adam Newport-Berra.
Yeah, I think I actually found out about the project because of the fact that it was oneers, that they wanted to do oneers. I think my agent actually mentioned it. She said, "Oh, Seth and Evan want to do the show. They want to shoot everything in one shot." And my agent knows that I love doing that. I've shot a lot of one-shot music videos, and I love doing it on the film and TV projects that I've done. And I pushed really hard to find out more, and basically just, worked my way up to a point where I got to have a meeting with them. And I thought that they would maybe have some sort of lofty conceptual idea of why they wanted to do it, but which they did to some degree. But really, when I first met them, they're like, "Yeah, we want to shoot the show with one camera, with one lens, and we want to do everything in one shot." That's literally how they said it. And then we started to dig in, and I started to understand their references and what got them excited, and also just how they like to work. I think that they've found coverage kind of boring, and I think they find the process to be a little bit sluggish sometimes on set. And I think they really wanted to have a show that had a ton of energy, had a lot of, intensity, and really built up the anxiety and stress around the film industry. And so there was a conceptual idea, but there was also a procedural idea behind it, in that they really wanted to be in an environment where everyone was just firing on all cylinders and we weren't slogging through coverage.
That's a great insight. And it was actually something that hadn't occurred to me, that it's sort of like from an actor's perspective. Of course, this is much more like, like you're doing theater almost. Like it's a very immediate, and believe me, we've all been on sets and shooting lots of coverage. I mean, it gets to be a grind. But I was really curious because they're writers and comics, like you do also kind of tie your hands together because you can't really adjust timing, for jokes and whatnot when you're editorial. So I'm kind of curious, like, how did you guys, make sure, what was the process? Was that just something that happened in rehearsal? Like you kept rehearsing until people just felt the timing was good and was ready to go?
First of all, they wrote to that, they knew that the material had to serve that purpose, that it had to help us. And then they also knew that we were going to be editing on set. And I think that was really exciting for all of us. And we involved the editor early on. He was there from day one working with us and workshopping scenes. And he was there at the monitor with the writers, with Seth, with Evan. And that was really integral because he's able to watch every take, talk about, how we could tighten up scenes where he felt like we needed a breath or a pause, and just really talk through what was working with the scene and what wasn't. And then, there was a lot of just like gut checking and vibe checking throughout shooting. We would rehearse a scene, we'd spend a lot of time with it. Oftentimes we would show up with the actors in the morning, rehearse it, and the rehearsal would start with literally just everyone sitting around and reading the script out loud, not walking it, just literally sitting there with the sides and leafing through it, talking about what we loved about the scene, what could be better. The writers were there. Seth and Evan were obviously there. I was there. Some of the crew would kind of be listening on, and we would just talk through it. And, then they would, as they started to read through it and get more proficient with it, we'd start to slowly walk it. And Seth would walk it with them and kind of guide them through things, pause, talk about where we could put people. And then as it got more real, I would come in with an iPad and start kind of just filming it and walking it and looking at angles and looking at how I could capture it. You know, sometimes just like gently guiding someone by the shoulder, being like, what if you just moved over there? You know, I tried not to do too much of that, but sometimes it was really useful. And we would just literally workshop the scene until it felt like something shootable. And then once we started shooting it and the actors really started bringing it, we would notice things that could get even better or things that needed to be edited out. And we would literally just sit there and workshop it because really we never did like backup takes, or obviously we didn't do coverage. So it was really just about honing it in and sharpening it to the point where it really hit.
What you just described filled me with terror. Well, because I just imagined when I read a little bit about how you guys did this, I just imagined that you guys must have previs the hell out of this and really meticulously planned everything, and just trying to build an entire show around wonders like this.
Yeah, I mean, that was sort of the general approach, right? I mean, there were obviously bigger set pieces that needed to be prepped. We didn't really storyboard anything. The only thing we storyboarded were the movies within movies, which we can talk about later. But, I would tech scout the location, or I would director scout with Seth and Evan, and with Julie, our production designer, and talk about the locations, talk about what we loved about them. And oftentimes in these scouts, we would just talk about shot ideas, ways to move the camera. And sometimes we would come up with something that Seth and Evan loved that they would then go back and write around. We'd be like, oh, it'd be amazing to move through this window, or it'd be amazing to start in the car driving down the street and then pop out and move into this building and then go out into the backyard. And then they would take that and run with it and go back, rewrite the script, write it into it. So we would do some of that, but to be honest, this show only works because of how funny it is and because of how amazing the characters are. And that's all my job was to serve that. So really, you could only do so much in prep. They obviously had good material to work with, and they spent a lot of time making great scripts. And then from there, it's just getting in the space with the actors and letting them like find it and working with them to find it and throwing out suggestions and playing around. And it often meant that, we wouldn't even roll by lunch. We would just be talking through things, which I think kind of terrified people at first. The AD was totally freaking out the first week.
Their line producers are like, what do you mean? Like, I want to see first shot by 10 a.m. on the production.
But then we would start rolling after lunch, and sometimes we'd wrap at 3 p.m. You know what I mean? And everyone started to understand kind of how it worked. So it was really magical to work that way.
So how freeform did it get? I mean, were the actors doing some improv as well, or?
Yeah, no, it was really dialed once we started rolling. We left as much to the imagination and to inspiration at the beginning of the day as we could. And then once we started working it, every single beat was accounted for. There wasn't a single breath that wasn't accounted for, down to like steps, you know what I mean? So it became tighter and tighter the more we did it. And, we obviously wanted these actors to be able to improv and bring some spontaneity and chaos to it, which they couldn't help but do. But they quickly learned that they could only do that in the breath that they were sort of given in the scene, right? So like the way I describe it is that actors would literally have a certain amount of syllables. Seth and I were talking about this the other day, and he's like, it's like jazz. You have a certain amount of bars that you get to improv, but then you have to take it from somebody. You can improv, but then you have to also hand it off to the next person. You have to know how the next person's going to catch it. And that's super important to how the show works.
That's a great way to describe it. That's amazing. You mentioned earlier one camera, one lens. Tell me a little bit about that. Like what was the lens of choice? How did you arrive at that? Did you have a pretty extensive testing process before you got shot?
This is one of my favorite parts about shooting this show. I really love working within the confines of some sort of restriction. I think it's, to me, in some ways, the most liberating thing that you can do, because it just frees up your mind to think about other things. Knowing that we only had one lens, I became really familiar with it. So I knew exactly what the field of view was. I knew exactly how to get a close up in a moment. I knew how to get a wide. I knew if I put the camera over there, exactly what I would see. And I think Seth and Evan felt the same way, that they wanted to simplify things so that they could free their mind to think of how to move the camera. So I did a little bit of testing. What I knew I wanted was a lens that was really versatile. I wanted something with really close focus so that I could jam up into someone's face and get a close up, or, pan down to something to get an insert of even a phone and then be able to whip pan right back up and right into a wide. So that was really important. I wanted a really fast lens so that I could work in it with as much available and natural light as possible, because we were often shooting 360. And I also wanted something that wasn't too soft, that it couldn't resolve wide open. A lot of fast lenses, when they're wide open, when you rack to a wide shot, people's faces start to fall apart. You can't really resolve detail. But I also didn't want something so clinically sharp that it felt really digital. There was, Seth and Evan really wanted it to feel filmic. They wanted the show to have texture. So I ended up going with a Zeiss Master Prime, which is, in terms of lenses, is fairly modern. It's not a super new lens. It was designed in the era of film. So I think it has not to say that there isn't a film era now. The movie I'm shooting right now is on film, and the last one I shot was on film. But they wanted to embrace that. So this is sort of like a more modern lens, but it still has a lot of character to it, and it has nice contrast. And I shot some tests with some other lenses, but I've worked with the Master Prime so much, I'm so familiar with them, that I knew it was going to be a solid workhorse. They're just so reliable, and the way the barrel is designed is perfect. It's just a really perfectly designed lens that's kind of bulletproof. We tested some older Zeiss Super Speeds, and some Ultra Primes, and they were interesting, but they almost had too much character. They were a little too I don't know, they were a little too glowy, or, some of them when we were on a wide shot that just didn't resolve as well. So the Master Prime just felt like the perfect choice.
With all of that insane choreography, I can't imagine how you guys were able to pull focus. I mean, how much focus pulling was there in the show? And tell me a little bit about how you guys were able to pull that off.
Oh yeah, I mean, the focus pulling was, one of the most challenging parts of it. Our first AC, Lucas Deans, is a genius, and it's really cool because it's not only is he, having to hit all these marks, but he's also having to take his own timing on a lot of this, and he's watching the scene as a fellow filmmaker and deciding when someone should be who should be in focus in the moment, because a lot of times there are 6, 7 people in a scene, and he has to know exactly who to rack to at every moment. And, a lot of times the focus rack is the comedy beat, right? So at certain points, my first AC is the director, and that he's telling the audience, look at this person, because just their reaction alone is what's going to tell the story here, So it's really fun. I think everyone in my crew, got to be a part of directing each scene, which is so special. And I think why the show is so amazing is because it's really collective filmmaking in that way.
So, I mean, obviously this conceit of the Oners reaches a hilarious kind of absurd height in episode 2, which is literally called the Oner, and the entire episode is designed to play out as a continuous 25-minute take, featuring this film crew as they're frantically trying to capture a Oner before the sun goes down at sunset. So what was your first reaction from when you heard from Seth and Evan that they wanted to do now this entire episode as one continuous shot?
Stress and anxiety. But also excitement. It's, something I'd never quite done before, and I was completely up to the challenge, and it kind of felt like the pinnacle of what we were going to do on the show. And I felt like it was going to be proof that the show either worked or did not work. So it was really like the crux of the season for me. And what I realized very quickly is there was no like answer or shortcut of how we were going to do this. It was really just about working through it and talking through every beat and just piecing it together until it became a whole episode. And it was really intimidating at first, but the more I talked through it with Seth and Evan, the more it became clear that we were going to figure it out. It was just going to take time. And I think, unlike some of the other episodes and the approach I was talking about earlier, we really had to spend time in the location with the script and just walk through it beat by beat. And just like I keep saying, we just kind of slogged through it. We would just do page turns in the space and talk about what were the interesting angles? How would it be to move through the rooms? How could we show off the location while still maintaining what we needed to pull off? And that was a location that we returned to a few times before we actually started shooting at, just because we knew we needed to be really dialed.
There's a hilarious moment in the episode when Sarah Polley plays the director of the movie within the movie, and she definitively announces this is going to be a true oneer, no whip pans, no hidden cuts.
We're not doing stitches.
I mean, even like 1917 would use whip pans to connect scenes.
We're not doing whip pans as a true oneer. There's no tricks. We're just going to do it.
Okay, great. Let's go.
But you didn't really have that option open to you with this episode, did you?
We did it. We did and we didn't. We shot it over. We had to shoot it over 4 days. The biggest reason was because we were, besides the office set, every location was practical. It was a real location. We're shooting outside. We're shooting, in real buildings. And this particular location was by far the most challenging location because of a lot of the reasons. One, it had all glass walls. You can see outside no matter where you are. So there's really no cheating magic hour, and secondly, the location is on a ridge, so there's really no flat space on the property. The only flat space is inside the house. Beyond that,
so there's no place for you to put base camp or anything. Everybody's just in the house all the time.
Exactly, and there's nowhere to hide big lights. Like one of my first ideas was, I can put a bunch of lights on cranes and kind of fake, late afternoon, evening light, and we can shoot for most of the day. I realized very quickly that was going to be completely impossible. And in some other circumstances, I would have come to the director and said, "Hey, I'm not sure this location really works for us."
Could we pick another iconic mid-century modern house to shoot this?
But I'm a big fan of architecture. I love that location.
Look, it's an iconic, John Lautner house. I mean, that
exactly.
You don't get much better than that. It's gorgeous.
And I think one thing I really learned on this show is to just never say no. I think. As DPs, a lot of our career is sort of like risk assessment and just being like, what can I pull off? What can I, how far can I get myself into something and still succeed? And I think what was really special about this show is that Seth and Evan really supported me and believed in me and really empowered me and the crew to pull anything off. So we felt really confident that we could figure something out. And they were also very flexible. If something wasn't working, they would be very quick to be like, okay, let's just rewrite that and figure something else out. Or if I saw an idea that was outside of the script, sometimes they would incorporate that into it. So it created an environment where it was almost impossible to say no, because we were so creative that we were always able to come up with a solution. So we really worked hard to figure out how we could pull this off. And what we realized is we needed to shoot it over a few days, because we needed to have Dusk multiple times. It was just not going to work. To shoot an entire episode in 2 hours it wouldn't have worked for us. Given, there's a version of it that could have worked, but it wasn't their show. They wanted everything. We wanted to go big on everything and really pull out all the stops. So we needed to have that time to prepare and to shoot, and not to mention that some of the actors weren't available all the days. So we had to piece out a couple of the.
You are kidding. So that answered one of my questions, which was like, how did you guys figure, was it linearly? Like, was it?
Yeah.
So, yeah. Wow.
Yeah. So
how did you figure?
On day one, we shot, and also like the car element was very complicated, and required a lot of choreography and also like locking down streets, so that we could drive through.
I was just about to say, because, this is like, this is not kind of a slow, happy, easy, mellow drive that he's taken through these little the streets in Silver Lake. Like, the whole idea is that Seth's late to get to set, so he's barreling along. Like,
oh yeah. Yeah. No, they were booking it. And I mean, the shows and my note to my crew was always, the first note was always faster. And I think that was often Seth's note to the actors. Seth and Evan would, we would do a rehearsal and they would walk out after seeing it on camera and go, cool, let's do it again faster. It's like, how can we pick this up? How can we pace it up? So yeah, we were always going at breakneck speed, and that often meant breaking gear, breaking cameras. We didn't do too much of that. The first week we broke some cameras. We learned very quickly how to avoid that. But yeah, we really wanted it to feel unhinged, and we wanted it to feel like anything could happen at any moment. So there was nothing slow and brooding and meditative about it. But basically we just kind of slogged through it. We're like, okay, day one, we're going to start in the car. We're going to get out of the car. We're going to get in the space, and we're going to get as far as we possibly can into the episode. Day two, at the end of that day, we found a stitch point where we could stitch it into the next day. And we just kept doing that so that by day 4, we knew that we were at a point where we could get to, our exit in the car post sunset into night.
Adding to the difficulty was this whole idea that the film crew is trying to get this at sunset, and then trying to capture the magic hour. So, before they lose the light. So were you really limited? You could only shoot like for a couple of hours around dusk, or how did you actually, was there any cheating possible for you?
Well, that location didn't allow for any of it. Every room had windows. There's the video village where Sarah's sitting by the monitor was sort of the most contained location, but there's still a massive skylight in that room. And because it's an old Lautner, we weren't allowed to even touch the roof of the building. Often I would just, in those situations, be like, cool, let's put some lights on the roof and I can control the lighting and I could shoot that any time of day and make it look like sunset. But we weren't even allowed to like put diffusion over the skylight. So I just had to live with it, and if you look really closely, you can tell, okay, like that light is coming in from a little too high of an angle, but I think we get away with it because there's so much going on. But yeah, no, we really had to rehearse all morning, have lunch, keep rehearsing, keep tuning the camera. And then, we were never sitting around waiting for the light because we always were, it was always down to the wire and we were just barely ready by the time we were rolling. But yeah, the sweet spot for rolling was a couple hours,
That's amazing. That's
amazing. We were also we were shooting, I can't remember when, I think we were shooting in the spring. The sunsets weren't particularly long, it wasn't like a summer sunset.
You have a lot of, in the show, you have a lot of camera moves from like, really strong side lighting where, the sun is kind of barreling in through the windows. And then you'll follow a couple of people into a dark hallway while they have a meaty conversation. Just tell me a little bit about like, how did you control for exposure when you were doing those crazy kind of moves?
Yeah, so that was kind of a learning process for us. And it was a mix of approaches. At first, depending, so in the Oner, we couldn't do this as much, but in some locations, I really tried to just blast as much light into the interior so that I didn't have to have a huge, stop change from outside to inside. But we're shooting in LA and it's sunny every day, and LA sun is a very particular source of light. And we often couldn't compete with it inside. So we had to do an iris rack of some sort. And at first we started doing it directly on the lens. Just, we would be wide open inside and then we'd go outside and we'd stop down and, you'd end up at like a 5.6, which really wasn't the aesthetic of the show. I really wanted to keep shallow focus as much as possible because, again, focus is storytelling in this show, and it's often really important, especially because we were on a 21, which is a wider lens. I really wanted to maintain shallow focus so that we could we could really choose where the plane of focus was so that even in a wide shot, I could be focused on one person talking. That was a tool we used to help tell the story, because if you're in a wide shot and everyone's in focus, it can be hard to direct the viewer's attention to somebody. So at first we were stopping down and we'd be outside and we'd be at a 5.6 and it'd be like, okay, this just feels doesn't quite feel like the show. Just the focus feels too deep. So what my crew came up with was using, I can't remember exactly what the name of it, but it's basically like a variable ND filter that's remote controlled. And it's two polarizers that, spin counter to each other and can basically create varying ND live. So, we can start with it basically doing nothing, and then by the time it goes outside, you spin that. There's, my DIT is literally adjusting the transmission through the filter as we go outside gradually so that we can maintain a wide open lens and, be changing the exposure as we're doing it, which is really cool. I thought that was, that ended up being a really useful tool for us.
And the main reason why you wanted to use that approach was that you could control the exposure without changing the focal length?
Without changing the iris. The aperture, basically. So the aperture, depending on your aperture, a wider aperture gives you a shallower depth of field. And I wanted to maintain that shallow depth of field. And the only way to do that is, normally if you were shooting coverage, I shoot a shot inside, I wouldn't have an ND filter in. I go outside, okay, it's much brighter. I'm going to put an ND 12 in, cut 4 stops of light so that I can maintain that wide aperture. But we couldn't drop filters in mid shot. So we had to use a filter that basically in shot would transition. It's basically like having like transition sunglasses, but for the camera.
The movie that Sarah Polley is shooting within the episode has a very different look than the episode. And I know that you got to play with this quite a bit over the course of the entire series. The movies within the series all have very distinctive, interesting looks. But can you talk a little bit about kind of designing the look of the movie within the movie for the Warner?
To be honest, the discussions about the movies within movies were not a huge focal point of the show. We talked briefly about them, and I would always ask as many questions as I could, and we would do some storyboarding. But Seth and Evan were like, we just want them to feel like Hollywood movies. Like, this is a period piece. This is a noir.
It's up to you to figure out what that means.
Well, a little bit, yeah. And I think one great idea that they had was like, let's shoot everything on anamorphic. So all the movies within movies are on anamorphic lenses, which just instantly gives it a different feel, a quote unquote cinematic feel. Yeah.
Uh-huh.
I hate that word so much. So that was like an easy, tool to just instantly separate our show from the movies within movies. And then beyond that, I kind of honestly just leaned into a lot of impulses I would not normally lean into when I'm shooting movies, which is just sort of like, Hollywood tropes. And I think to a point where if you watch the Oner, it's like, and you watch what Sarah Polley's directing, you're not like, it's not a movie Sarah Polley would really make, right? Like, that's not an Oscar nominated movie. But I think that there's some humor in that. And I think we leaned into that. And I think for Seth and Evan, that wasn't necessarily the point. And I'd be curious in season 2 if we carved that out a little bit more and explored a little deeper. But for us, we were just like, we just want it to feel like a movie that you're going to go see in theaters and, buy popcorn to watch.
Well, one of my favorite in the episode is that stunt with Matt falling over the champagne bucket and then getting up covered in blood.
Yo, I actually meant to talk to you about awards season. Just make sure you keep your winter clear.
Okay, Matt.
Cut! I'm so sorry. I'm sorry, Greta. I'm so sorry. I'm sorry.
Reset! Back to 1! Losing life!
Matt, are you okay? Oh, that looks really bad.
No, it's okay. Just keep rolling!
That it?
Yeah, you heard the studio head. Let's just get the shot.
Keep shooting!
You should sit down.
It's okay. I'm fine. I'm fine.
Roll now.
Roll cameras.
Oh my God.
It's okay. Just film more.
Like, how did you guys pull that off? Obviously, that must have been a Stitch moment.
That was a Stitch moment. And to Seth's credit, Seth loves doing a lot of his own stunts. I actually am shooting a movie with him right now. And yesterday he did his own stunt and took a really hard fall at the first shot up of the day, took a massive fall, got back up. And then we shot with him for the rest of the day. And, he's amazing. But, some of the falls in the studio, we wanted to just really send, and we wanted to like really sell it. So and we needed Seth for the rest of the shoot, so it wasn't worth risking. So we had a great stunt double, and we would, we found a simple stitch, which I think was, as I'm trying to remember exactly what it is, but I think we're in a conversation, or we're with him in the bathroom. He comes out, he's talking to Greta. We whip to Greta, and then as we whip back to him, we're into the double. We're following him. He takes that really hard fall. We whip up to Ike and Sarah coming around the corner, and when we whip back down, Seth's there. Which, on paper sounds quite simple, but it was actually quite challenging because we're shooting at magic hour. So we knew we could only have so many takes, because when you stitch, you can't just, we had to shoot with the exact same light. It's really important that you're matching as much as you possibly can between takes. And we weren't in a controlled lighting environment. So we had to shoot everything up to that moment, knowing that we're going to get the, important performance and comedy beats with Seth and Greta. And then immediately, as soon as we get that take, say, cool, we got it, rush in the stunt double. We're going to whip into that, shoot that. Maybe, I think I don't know if we did more than one take. We probably did 1 or 2 takes of it. And then as soon as we got that, we're like, cool, pick a take, because that's the take you have to use. You can't pick a take in editorial, because we have to match one take, and we have to keep shooting in like the next 10 minutes. So we watched playback quickly. Often we would know the take before we watched playback. We'd just be like, that one felt right. That one was hilarious. Picked our take, and then we're like, cool. All right. What was on the ground? What fell? Where's the mess? Let's make sure it's exactly like that. Where was everyone standing? And that was a big thing. We had a lot of background, and we kept, it was really important. The AD team was amazing, and just reminding them, like, you can never forget where you are in any one moment. And so they're all shuffling around, like, where were my feet? What was I holding? Who was I talking to? Screaming, all right, everybody ready? And then just whip out of that. And then we just kept going with it. It's not this precious process where we're taking humming and hawing and scratching our heads and talking about ideas. We're like, let's get this fucking show on the road.
You got like 5 minutes with the stunt guy to do the thing. Meanwhile, Seth is over in the back getting made up with the blood, and like
seriously, exactly, yeah.
That's why, yeah, because you can't take 30 minutes to reset when you're in a situation like that.
Yeah.
That is insane.
Yeah, as well.
Speaking of insane, you must have had some insane camera rigging to accomplish these handoffs, and especially like in and out of the car stuff. I saw some pictures of like, in the car, the guy's like riding in the back of the little old car, and then just jumps out. So tell me a little bit about the sort of the setups for your handoffs, and like your crew must have just been amazing.
Yeah, I did have an amazing crew. And I think the one thing I keep coming back to is that our approach is always to keep it as simple as humanly possible. To me, the show works best when it's a camera on a guy's shoulder, and we're just running around perfectly choreographed with the blocking and the talent, and we're just figuring it out with the fewest tools possible. I always told my crew, we only go off, we only use rigs if there's absolutely no other way to do it. I'm very disinterested in using tech for tech's sake. I think the purest way we can do it is almost always the best. So 99% of the show is literally just a camera on a guy's shoulder. And like to your point, one of my favorite shots is in near the end of episode 1, when Matt goes up to Patty's house, to another incredible Lautner house. And Seth wanted to start in the car to establish the neighborhood, drive up to the driveway, get out of the car, knock on the door, walk into the house, and walk into the backyard. And there was talk about, okay, what's the camera rig on the car? How are we going to mount it? How are we going to get it off? And we had a lot of discussions about using gimbals and magnet mounts, which we use a lot in the show. And what we quickly realized is, hey, the trunk comes off, and we can just put the camera operator in the trunk. It was a tiny convertible. That was the biggest challenge. I was like, shit, this convertible can barely fit Seth in it. Like, there's no way camera operator is going to fit it on it. So we're going to have to mount a camera somewhere. And then I think my key grip just looked and was like, the trunk is like 2 screws. We can just bolt it off. So we popped it out.
You basically just built a jump seat in for him, right?
Exactly. I mean, it's literally an Apple box strapped down. And Jesse Kane, one of our camera operators, was wearing a harness and was, strapped in with a carabiner. But, he got in the back seat and put the camera on his shoulder. We drove up. Mark Golnick, our main camera operator, was, waiting in the bushes. As the car pulled up, Mark sprints out, gets his shoulder ready. Jesse gingerly slides it onto Mark's shoulder. Mark takes it. And meanwhile, there are grips who are unbuckling Jesse. Jesse, rolls out of the back. Someone rips the Apple box out. Another grip has the trunk of the car and is popping it back on so that we don't have to replace that in post. And then we just continue on with the shot. So like that to me is a moment where I'm really proud that we were able to do it just with, that's something film school kids could do. If you have enough people and you have enough gumption, you can pull it off. You don't need you don't need hundreds of thousands of dollars of equipment to do that. And I love that about it. And then there are other shots that were obviously more complicated where we used, like a Rogen gimbal. We always still use the Alexa 35 with the Master Prime. I never wanted to veer from that. So we were able to build a really tight, small gimbal rig that Jesse Kane, our operator, operated and built and was really proficient with. And there were a lot of ways we would use that. Sometimes we would mount it onto a vehicle with electromagnetic mounts, which was really awesome. We'd have little batteries attached to it, and it's literally with the flick of a switch, it becomes, a positive mount, or if you turn it off, it just is sitting there. So a grip could come and just switch it on and off, and we could take it and run with it. And then we had a lot of techno crane mounts where we'd have, it hanging on the end of a techno crane, either at the start of the shot, and we'd pull it off to go up to a second story window, something like that. Or we would be walking with it and pop it on to the crane so that it could, go somewhere else. And that was quite complicated because we were often using really long, really heavy cranes, and these telescoping cranes require a lot of counterweight, right? And when you have a camera on a gimbal, even if it only weighs like 40, 50 pounds, if it's extended 50 feet, that's a massive counterweight. So we'd have 8 grips on the other end holding the crane, because as soon as you take that little camera off, that crane just wants to skyrocket into the air, so these guys would have to catch it. And then often within seconds, the camera would be panning directly where the crane was. So those guys who were catching the bucket of the crane would then be rolling it, 20 feet out of shot, barely just within inches of the edge of frame. So it was really just this like brutal ballet of a lot of very heavy equipment. And meanwhile, these actors have to like pull off these, 8-minute takes and be completely off book with these really dense scenes.
While all this chaos is happening around them.
Which in some ways, I actually think, I can't speak for the actors, but I think it kind of helped the performance in that they just felt there's this like volatility that at any moment something terrible could happen. And I think the show actually has that feeling that of kind of impending doom. And I felt everyone felt that on set, is that like at any moment a take could go completely haywire.
I completely agree with you. And in fact, I started my career as a PA on set. Like I've spent a lot of time on sets, and I just, after watching the Oner, I actually had to stop and not watch the show for a couple of weeks, because it was just I was having too much PTSD. It was too stressful.
I guess I have a knack for that. I think people said that a lot about the Bear when I started, when the pilot came out. I had a lot of friends who, and my wife who worked in the food industry. People just have a lot of PTSD about those situations. But I don't know. I think there's something really fun about it.
Tell me a little bit about post. The show has such a distinctive visual style, and I got to say, it looks amazing on Apple TV Plus streaming and Dolby Vision. Tell me about your approach to using HDR and specifically Dolby Vision. How involved are you in the grade? What's that process for you?
Yeah, I try to work with the same colorist on as many of my projects as I possibly can. Damien van der Kruisen has done almost every movie that I've shot and TV show. And we kind of got our start in the narrative world together, and he has since skyrocketed to colorist fame, and I just try to keep up with him as much as I can and try to book him whenever he's available. But Damien and I worked together from a pretty early point. As soon as I knew that I was shooting the show, any projects I get, I immediately call him and tell him what I'm doing and what I want to try, looks I want to try to achieve. And Damien and I worked together with the directors, in this case, Seth and Evan, and I talked about the look of the show, talked about color palette. We also talked with Julie, our production designer. I was really excited and impressed when I started to see Julie's renderings of the show. You know, the color palette is actually quite nostalgic and, you know, of a different era, which got me really excited. I didn't know that going into it, they were really going to lean into that. But we basically built a lookbook of sort of color palette and contrast and talked about movies we loved. And then I take that to Damien, sort of as a guide to the color. And from there, we shoot some test footage and Damien just starts to play with it and he creates a LUT that we end up shooting with for the rest of the show. And in this case, the LUT was great. We didn't have to tweak it much in post, but we did have to spend a lot of time in color just matching, you know, between scenes, and also just doing a lot of tracking on faces because we were shooting with natural light a lot of the times or 360 lighting. I wasn't able to do a lot of, you know, specific lighting or, you know, a lot of lighting I would normally do on a movie where if I'm in a close up, you know, I give a little love to someone's face. I wasn't really able to do that. We did a lot of bounce and negative fill on set, but we weren't able to sculpt things as much as we normally could. So Damien was able to help a lot with bringing people's faces out or, you know, balancing skin tones, had a lot of different skin tones in the show and just making everyone look great. You know, it was really important that the show felt really magical and beautiful. Like we didn't want, you know, there was a version of this show that is a lot rawer. And I think we wanted the camera work to be raw. We wanted the performances to be spontaneous, but we wanted it to have a really like dreamy, nostalgic kind of beautiful Hollywood look to it, you know? So that was super important. And so Damien and I spent a lot of time, workshopping the scenes and making them look as good as they could be. And then from there, I thought Damien is really great with translating our sort of conceptual creative ideas and then taking that into the HDR world and making sure that it still sparkles on TV because, you know, as we all know, every screen is different and television is different than film. And Damien gets that kind of better than anyone else. And I kind of really just trust him to dial it in for how people are going to see it at home.
If you know that something's going to be finishing in HDR or Dolby Vision, does that affect any of your decisions during production, how you light and shoot?
To be honest, not really. I think, again, I'm not the most technical DP in the world. For me, it more goes off feelings and vibes and energy than it does like technical finishing aspects. I know that like for me, when I know something is going to be seen more on someone's TV screen versus a theater, I tend to shoot differently just in terms of, you know, if I'm watching something on set, I'm like, okay, how is this going to translate to a big screen versus a smaller screen? I definitely think about that in terms of like the final finishing formats, a little less so. But that said, I was really excited to shoot this on the Alexa 35 because it kind of is that perfect mix of higher resolution and a really beautiful texture. The camera has like built-in texture. And so we did also do some tests with grain. The camera has internal grain. We wanted to give the show something a little different. We didn't want it to feel too clean. And I think the Alexa 35 feels really natural. It does feel clean, but in a way that still has life and character to it.
Adam, thank you so much for coming on the Dolby podcast to talk to us about the studio and specifically about episode 2, The Oner. It's pretty amazing. It's a pretty amazing achievement. Congratulations.
Hey, thanks so much. Thanks for the good questions.
Many thanks to Adam for joining us on the podcast today. And an extra special thanks to our friends at Apple for helping us put this conversation together. Be sure to check out the studio, now streaming on Apple TV Plus in Dolby Vision and Dolby Atmos. We have links, as always, in our show notes. And if you'd like even more conversations with artists and filmmakers about how they use technology to tell their stories, be sure you are subscribed to us here at Dolby Creator Talks. If you're curious to know more about what we do at Dolby Creator Lab, head on over to dolbycreatorlab.com. There you'll find information about all of our programs. You can access the entire library of episodes of the show, and you can sign up for our mailing list. Until next time, this is Dolby Creator Talks. I'm your host, Glenn Kaiser. Our producer and editor is Michael Coleman. Our executive producers are Amanda Schneider and Jack Ferry, with additional editing by Matt Nixon. And our production coordinator is Karen Marroquin. Thanks for joining us.